My parents kicked me out the night I got into college. No warning, no argument. Just my father pointing to the door and saying, "Pack your things, Mira. We're done supporting you." My mother didn't even look at me. She folded a wrinkled $10 bill into my hand like she was paying off a debt, not sending her daughter into the night. That was how my childhood ended. Quietly, coldly, and absolutely. But here's the part no one ever sees coming. 6 years later, someone from that same house, the home that threw me out, walked into my office and asked me for a favor so big it could change everything. And trust me, it was the last person I ever expected to see again. Before I tell you what she wanted, and what I finally said after 6 years of silence, tell me where you're listening from. It's easier to share this when I know I'm not the only one who's been pushed aside by their own family. My name is Mira Walsh, born and raised in the quiet, tightly wound town of Windsor Ridge, Ohio. My father, Hank, owned a motorcycle repair shop and believed in choosing one child to carry the family legacy. My mother, Elise, kept the finances and kept the peace by avoiding anything that might upset my brother. And my brother, Aaron, he was the chosen one. Every praise, every dollar, every dream in that house belonged to him long before I ever had a chance. Still, I worked hard. After-school shifts at Miller's Hardware, tutoring kids whose parents had bigger hopes for them than mine ever did for me, saving every dollar in a shoebox under my bed. So when my acceptance letter from Riverbend University arrived, thick envelope, gold seal, I let myself hope for one stupid moment. I thought maybe effort finally counted. Maybe they'd see me. But when I handed my father the letter, he didn't even read it. "We can only afford one future," he said. Then came the words that cut deeper than anything else. "You need to leave tonight. We can't carry you anymore." I walked out into the rain with one backpack and a $10 bill. I thought that was the end of my story. I had no idea it was the beginning of the moment the past would come back and stand on the other side of my desk, asking for mercy. The first night after being kicked out didn't feel real. It felt like I was walking through someone else's life, someone less lucky, someone more disposable. I kept thinking my mom would call, or my dad would open the door and say he didn't mean it. But the phone stayed silent, and the house behind me stayed dark. At first I told myself it was temporary. Just one night. One mistake they'd fix in the morning. But the morning came, and nothing changed. That was the gentle beginning. The soft ache before the real bruising started. I spent that first night under the bus stop awning, hugging my backpack like it was armor. Cars hissed through the wet street, headlights washing over me like brief interrogations. No one stopped. No one cared. I kept replaying my father's voice. "We're done supporting you." It looped in my head until it didn't hurt. It numbed. By the second night, the numbness cracked. The cold sank through my jeans. My hair smelled like rain and exhaustion. And the $10 my mother gave me felt like an insult every time I touched it. It wasn't help. It was dismissal disguised as generosity. That's when the tension started to rise, small but sharp. I tried calling a friend from school, but she didn't pick up. I tried another. Straight to voicemail. And suddenly, I realized something ugly. No one knew me well enough to take me in, or maybe no one wanted to. On the third night, the cold settled into my bones in a way that felt dangerous. My hands shook. My breath came out ragged. The street looked warped, like the world was losing focus. I remember thinking, this is what disappearing feels like. Not dramatic, just slow, quiet, unnoticed. Then came the first real rupture. A man approached me outside the 24-hour diner. Big coat, rough voice. "You got somewhere to be?" he asked. My heartbeat scraped my ribs. "I'm fine," I lied. He stepped closer. Too close. "Didn't ask if you were fine." It was the first time fear turned physical. Hot, metallic, dizzying. I backed away so fast I slipped on the sidewalk. For a second I thought, this is it. This is how low it goes. Then a truck horn blared. A man in a flannel jacket shouted from across the lot, "Hey, leave her alone!" The stranger stumbled off into the dark. The man who intervened walked over, older, gray beard, tired eyes. "You all right?" he asked gently. I could barely nod. He drove me to the ER because I was shivering uncontrollably. I remember bright lights, the smell of antiseptic, nurses asking questions I could barely answer. "Address?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. The nurse typed, "Unknown." Seeing it on the wristband made everything collapse inside me. Unknown, like I didn't belong anywhere. That was when the escalation hit full speed, the realization that I didn't have a home, a plan, or even a name attached to a place. They discharged me 2 days later with a pamphlet for Haven House, a shelter tucked between a pawn shop and a laundromat. I didn't want to go. Going felt like admitting I'd truly fallen through every crack. But when I stepped inside, warm air hit my face. Someone handed me a blanket. And for the first time in days, I didn't feel hunted by the cold. Ruth, the woman running the shelter, looked me straight in the eye. Really looked. "You get a bed and one chance to rebuild," she told me. "Don't waste it." Something inside me shifted, almost painfully. A small spark, thin, trembling, but alive. That was the moment the emotional pressure finally exploded. Not outward, inward. A breaking open. I cried harder than I ever had in my life, ugly, shaking, unstoppable tears. Not just from fear, not just from exhaustion, but because someone finally spoke to me like I mattered. And in that messy, unraveling moment, the girl who had been kicked out died a little, and someone new, someone tougher, sharper, hungrier, started to take her place. Life at Haven House didn't instantly make things easier, but it gave me something I hadn't felt in weeks. Structure, a bed, a door that locked, a thin blanket that somehow still felt like safety. It wasn't comfort, but it was enough to remind me that I hadn't disappeared. The days started blending together in a quiet rhythm. Morning chores, job searches on the community computer, evening sweeping hallways or folding laundry. My body was tired, but the exhaustion felt clean, not like survival, but like effort. At first, I kept my head down. I didn't want to take up space. I didn't want anyone asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. But people notice things in shelters. They notice the ones who aren't ready to talk, the ones who are still shaking off the darkness they crawled out of. One afternoon, while I was scrubbing floors, Ruth paused beside me. "You work like someone who thinks rest is a reward," she said. I didn't know what to say, so I shrugged. "It's just cleaning." She knelt down to help, her voice warm but unflinching. "No, it's rebuilding. Don't confuse the two." Those words lodged themselves in me like seeds. Still, rebuilding wasn't linear. Some days I woke up hopeful. Others felt like trying to climb out of a pit with oil-slick walls. I'd catch myself checking my phone even though there were no missed calls, no messages, no "we're sorry" from home. The silence wasn't just painful. It became confirmation. They had meant it. They weren't coming. The emotional tension rose every time I passed someone laughing with their sister on the street or overheard a mother talking to her daughter in the grocery store. I'd force my eyes away, pretending it didn't sting, but it did. Every time. Then came the first small shift. One morning, I saw a handwritten flyer pinned to the shelter's corkboard. "Help wanted. Alvarez Diner." No experience needed. Apply in person. Something about the simplicity of it felt like an open door, even if just a crack. Ruth noticed me staring at it. "You should go," she said. "What if they don't hire me?" I asked. She smiled in that blunt, matter-of-fact way of hers. "Then try again somewhere else. You're not fragile, even if you think you are." The next morning, I walked the 3 blocks to Alvarez Diner in shoes that weren't mine and a thrift store coat with a missing button. The diner smelled like burnt toast, syrup, and old coffee, the kind of place where nothing is perfect, but everything is honest. Behind the counter was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and sleeves rolled to her elbows. "You here for the job?" she asked without looking up. I am, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Ever waited tables? No, but I learn fast. She finally looked at me, really looked, and nodded once. Grab an apron. If you last the week, you're hired. Just like that, something clicked inside me. A chance, a real one. But chances don't come without friction. The first few days were brutal. Coffee burns, heavy trays, customers tapping their fingers when I was too slow. My feet throbbed, my back ached. Elena, my boss, never sugarcoated anything. You missed a spot. Don't apologize, fix it. People pay attention to detail. You should too. It should have crushed me. But weirdly, it didn't. Maybe because her corrections weren't cruel. They were expectations, something my parents had never given me unless it was for my brother. And slowly, I started noticing patterns. Which tables needed extra napkins, which customers always asked for refills, when deliveries came late, how supplies got misplaced. The diner wasn't chaotic, it was unorganized. So I started organizing. Refilling condiments by section, labeling supplies, stacking invoices by delivery date, tracking which items kept running out. At first, Elena frowned at my changes. Then, one morning, she found the small notebook I kept tucked in my apron, filled with notes, charts, tiny systems. She flipped through it slowly, then tapped the page with a fingernail. "This is good," she said. Her voice wasn't soft, but it was something better. Respect. That was the moment the tension inside me cracked open, not into pain, but into possibility. For the first time since being kicked out, I wasn't surviving. I was building. And somewhere in that messy diner, between the smell of grease and the sound of clattering dishes, a thought I hadn't dared to consider finally surfaced. Maybe I wasn't the problem my parents walked away from. Maybe I was someone they never bothered to see. Working at Alvarez Diner didn't magically fix my life, but it became the first place where my effort actually mattered. Not because anyone handed me compliments, but because I could feel the shift, tiny at first, like a loose thread pulling free. Every day I learned more about how the diner operated, or more accurately, how it didn't operate. Deliveries came late, orders got mixed up, inventory disappeared into some mysterious black hole. It wasn't chaos by nature, it was chaos by neglect. And for some reason, that chaos made my brain light up. One afternoon, the delivery truck screeched into the alley 20 minutes behind schedule. The driver, Ben, a guy who looked like he'd been built entirely out of flannel and coffee, jumped out swearing about traffic. I helped him unload the crates, sorting things without thinking. Perishables here, dry goods there, eggs stacked carefully so we wouldn't lose another dozen to bad packaging. He paused and watched me for a moment. "You always organize things like that?" I shrugged. "Makes it easier later." He grinned. "Well, don't stop. This place needs it." That was the first time I realized people could notice my strengths without turning them into weapons. Over the next weeks, I kept refining the systems in quiet ways. A labeled box here, a reorganized shelf there, nothing dramatic, just improvement. And Elena noticed. She was a tough woman, blunt, practical, allergic to unnecessary words. But she started watching me differently. Less like a rookie waiting to fail, more like someone who might actually keep the place standing. One night after closing, I stayed late wiping tables and sketching a flowchart on a napkin, ways to streamline deliveries, reduce wasted time, save money. I left it on the counter, planning to throw it away later. By morning, it was gone. I found Elena in the kitchen holding the napkin like it was a blueprint to a new world. "You did this?" "Yeah," I said, suddenly nervous. "It's just an idea." She shook her head. "It's more than that. Keep thinking like this." Those 6 words felt like gasoline thrown onto a tiny flame inside me, but with growth comes friction. Some of the older staff didn't like the changes. "Who does she think she is?" "She's messing up the system." "What system? We've managed fine for years." I tried to ignore it, but the comments sank in, slow and heavy. It reminded me too much of home, of being the outlier, the one who didn't fit the predetermined shape of the family. But then, something shifted again. On a Saturday morning, the diner was slammed. Orders piled up. A delivery arrived early. A faucet broke. Coffee overflowed. It was the kind of day that could break a person, or reveal them. Elena tossed me the keys. "You take the front. I'll handle the kitchen." My heart hammered, but adrenaline steadied my hands. I reorganized the wait list, rerouted tables, communicated with the kitchen like a traffic controller, and fixed the supply issue in the pantry between customers. By noon, we weren't drowning. We were gliding. When the rush ended, Elena walked over with a dish towel slung over her shoulder. "You ran the place today," she said. I almost laughed. "Just did what needed to be done." She shook her head. "No, Mira. You saw what needed to be done. That's different." Her praise hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't used to being seen. Not really. And that's when the next door opened. A week later, Ben, the delivery driver, showed up with a flyer. "Thought of you when I saw this," he said. It was for a clerk position at Everline Freight, the logistics company he contracted with. "They need someone who understands systems," he added. "You'd be good." I stared at the flyer, unsure. "I don't have a degree." He shrugged. "Some people have instincts instead. Trust me, that matters." Instinct. No one had ever used that word for me before. I applied. The interview was nothing like I imagined. Tom Whitaker, the manager, didn't care about perfect answers. He cared about how my mind worked. "When something goes wrong," he asked, "what's your first instinct?" "Figure out the pattern," I said without thinking. He leaned back, smiling faintly. "That's what logistics is. Welcome to Everline." I walked out of that building with a feeling I'd never had before. I belonged somewhere. Everline became my crash course in rebuilding myself. I learned spreadsheets, route planning, communication chains, crisis mitigation. I stayed late, came early, and took every challenge like a dare. The more I learned, the more I realized something simple and terrifying. I wasn't broken when my parents kicked me out. I was underestimated, and the higher I climbed, the more one truth solidified. If I could thrive in a diner and excel in a freight company with no degree, no money, no safety net, then where else could I go? What else could I build? That question wasn't just a spark. It was a fuse, ready to burn into something they never saw coming. Everline didn't just change my life. It rewired something in me. For the first time, I wasn't surviving out of fear. I was operating out of capability. Every spreadsheet, every late-night reroute, every crisis that landed on my desk felt like a puzzle only I could see the edges of. And the more I solved, the more the people around me shifted the way they looked at me. Not pity, not condescension, respect. Real, earned respect. Tom started trusting me with decisions that usually took someone a decade in the industry to handle. When a storm shut down half the Midwest routes, he handed me the mess and said, "Do what you think is best." I stayed until sunrise, mapping alternatives, calling drivers, redirecting shipments. By the time the city woke up, the system was moving again. Tom didn't say much, he never did, but the look he gave me at the doorway felt like a passing of the torch. And that's when a new thought started creeping into my mind. A quiet one at first, almost shy. If I can do all this for someone else, what could I build for myself? The idea wouldn't leave me alone. It followed me on lunch breaks, on bus rides home, in the quiet minutes before bed at the shelter. I kept thinking about small businesses. How many of them were drowning, not because they were bad, but because no one ever taught them how to operate like the big players. I understood chaos. I knew how to tame it. And that realization felt less like ambition and more like purpose. So at 23, with shaky hands and everything I owned in one duffel bag, I opened Walsh Operations Consulting out of a cramped loft office above a print shop. My furniture was mismatched. My laptop wheezed whenever I opened too many tabs. The heater worked only when it felt like it. but it was mine. Every square foot, every scribbled idea, every late-night burst of hope. The first clients came slowly. A bakery owner who couldn't figure out why her inventory vanished every week. A florist who had deliveries arriving hours late. A mechanic shop, ironically, the same kind of business my father ran, overwhelmed by supplier delays. I fixed their systems one by one, and word spread faster than I expected. 5 clients turned into 12. 12 turned into 30. I hired my first assistant, then my second, and suddenly I wasn't the girl sleeping at a bus stop anymore. I was Mira Walsh, 25 years old, with a staff, a real office, and a brand people actually recognized. Some nights I'd stay late just to look at the view from my window, the streets below glowing with traffic and possibility, the city humming like a machine I finally knew how to read. I thought the past was behind me. I thought I'd built enough distance, enough success, enough new identity to never feel that old sting again. But life doesn't ask if you're ready. One Tuesday morning, Maya, my HR manager, stood in my doorway holding her tablet. Her tone was casual, but something in her face wasn't. "We've got a candidate for the operations coordinator role," she said. "Impressive resume." I nodded, still skimming my emails. "Her name is—" Maya hesitated. "Hannah Walsh." The room didn't go silent. I did. Hannah, my brother's fiancée. The woman my family praised like she was made of gold. The life they chose over me. And just like that, the world I built, every brick, every inch earned in pain, shifted under my feet. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew the past had finally caught up, and this time I wasn't the one standing at the door, hoping to be let in. In the end, it wasn't the success that surprised me. It wasn't the office, or the skyline view, or the clients who trusted my name enough to build their futures on it. What surprised me most was how quiet healing feels when it finally arrives. There was no dramatic moment, no apology big enough to rewind time, just a slow, steady understanding that I didn't need the people who walked away from me to validate the person I had become without them. Hannah getting hired was never about revenge. It wasn't about proving anything to my parents either. It was about choosing the kind of leader, the kind of woman I wanted to be. Someone who didn't repeat the harm she had survived, someone who refused to mistake bitterness for strength. And somewhere along the way, I realized something simple and painfully earned. Family isn't defined by blood. Family is defined by who stays, who shows up, and who sees you when you're invisible. That's the line I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that the door that closes on you today might be the same door you hold open for someone else tomorrow. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because you finally know your worth isn't something anyone can take or give away. To everyone who's ever been pushed aside, underestimated, or told they weren't enough, I hope my story reminds you that your beginning doesn't decide your ending, and that sometimes the life you build from scratch becomes stronger than the one you lost. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. It means more than you know. If this story touched something in you, let me know in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, or which moment stayed with you the longest. I promise I read every single one, and if you'd like to walk with me a little further, there's another story waiting. One I think you'll want to hear. So if you haven't already, feel free to like the video, subscribe, and gently tap the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. Because the next chapter, it's one you won't want to miss.